I'm delighted to have June Easton here to talk about her experiences with the Women's Center in Marquette, Michigan. We are putting her interview as a part of the series on the history of the Women's Center. Welcome, June, and if you can give us a little bit of your background information, and then we'll talk specifically about your role with the Women's Center.
Great, thank you, Jane. Well, my background information, I got my master's at Northern, just prior to my involvement with the Women's Center, and became licensed as a psychologist, a limited licensed psychologist, and I currently am living in Southern California and continue to work with women, volunteer in various places, and so the skills that I gained at the Women's Center have been very much a part of my life over all these years.
Okay. Were you here at the very beginning of the Women's Center in Marquette? When did you arrive in Marquette, and how did you happen to be here?
Well, we moved here, I guess it was in '61. And yes, I was here at the very beginning. I was here when the first consciousness raising groups were being organized, and that was in the late '60s, I think.
In early '70s, yeah.
And early '70s, and so I was in one of the consciousness raising groups, and there were 4 or 5 of us that met weekly for a couple of years.
Do you recall how those got started? So many of the women who have been interviewed remember participating, but they don't remember what initiated it.
Well, I do remember being in several large meetings. I think one at Pat Miklow's home, and I think maybe another at Carlin Rapport's. And so somehow these groups got organized, I believe, through us all gathering together, and then somehow, I was trying to remember that myself. I don't know if we self-selected, and created our own groups, or if somehow somebody organized that. I don't recall.
It seems to be a void in remembering.
Yes.
Yeah, all right. And then how did that lead to actual involvement in the Women's Center? Did you help set it up? Did you use were you called upon to use your counseling skills? I seem to recall somebody said you were actually hired as a counselor.
As a counselor, right. No, I really wasn't involved in the initial organization and structuring of the Women's Center. The way that I became involved was Judy Russell was the first counselor there, and she created a paraprofessional program, and I was one of that first group of parapros where she provided trainings, and then we led small groups like assertiveness training and other kinds of groups. And so I was one of those first parapros. And it was because at that point I had not gotten my master's when I first started working with a paraprofessional group. And it was because of my involvement there and leading the groups that I decided I wanted to go back to college and get my master's and eventually graduate. So that had a profound impact on me. And I loved the community of women and leading those groups. It really was a shift and a change in my life for me.
Excellent. Tell me a little bit more in detail about assertiveness training. Again, many have mentioned that, but nobody's really described. I think maybe we take it for granted nowadays what that is, but why was that a necessary kind of group?
Well, it was, at that time, just in our culture in general, women's roles were somewhat to be more in the background, supportive of husbands, nurturing for children, and very important roles, but very limited. And so these assertiveness training groups were helping women to learn to be aware of what they really wanted, and then to ask for it. And we would do role playing, and it could be about very small issues, because that's where you start. You start with with just small issues in the women's lives, and we would role play and model it. You know, I would model different possibilities of how to ask for whatever they wanted to bring up, and then they would pick what fit for them, and they would practice it themselves, and it was pretty dramatic, the kinds of changes that took place in people's lives. I think they were like 7-week workshops, is what I recall.
And how were the women who took part in those recruited? Did they just know that the Women's Center was offering these and sign up, or did people go out into the community? And
No, Judy Russell asked if I would be interested in being a paraprofessional. And then when Judy left, and I think that was in like the mid to late 70s, that was when I applied for that position. And so then I was hired as the counselor. And the paraprofessional program was really a key part of that job. And I think when I was counselor there, I think we had about 30 paraprofessionals. And it was important to have women from Marquette, from Ishpeming, and Negaunee, you know, in some of the, in all of the surrounding cities that we were able to find women. And so it would be, women that we would, perhaps after we started too, it was women that were in some of our groups that we could see had some kind of, had leadership skills and might be interested, and then we would approach them and ask, would you be interested in doing this?
so it might have contributed to many people, like you mentioned, it made a difference in your own career track and
Absolutely. And really when I was counselor, one of the things that I really wanted to do was to create a sense of community with the paraprofessionals. And I would set up ongoing training so that once a month we would get together, these 30 women, and I would guide them through all sorts of various active listening, a lot of the kinds of things that they might be interested in doing with groups of women that they would be leading, so that they would have some of that experience. And so really a very strong community, a sense of connection and caring and support developed in this group of paraprofessionals.
And because many of the women interviewed have mentioned how cutting edge Marquette seemed to be throughout not just the area but the country, where were the lessons coming from about active listening and assertiveness, and what were the sources that gave you the skills to teach women?
Right. Well, some of that would have been from my master's training in terms of the basic skills.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the structure of various workshops, I really can't remember where those came from. We have a kitty joining us.
But there was structured ways of going
yes,
about it, and
these were structured workshops,
right.
And most of them were 7-week. Weekly, and we tried to make some evenings, some during the day, and then there were also some that were one day, like all day Saturday, for instance, and that could be perhaps for women, maybe from Gwyn or some other community where we may not have some paraprofessionals offering groups, but they could come in for a day, as opposed to it being more difficult for them to come.
And how did these women find out about the availability of these classes? Again, was there advertising or pretty much word of mouth? How did
No, that the promoting and marketing essentially for these programs was a big part of my job too, and that was, I would do radio interviews, and also in all of the local papers. Each week there would be a listing of the workshops that would. That were in the process, that would be offered in their area. And there were a lot. There was assertiveness training, that was one of the key ones, assertiveness training, but there were also values clarification workshops, there were confidence building workshops, there were goal setting workshops, I remember one of the the day-long workshops, which was on, I can't remember the name of it, but it was helping the women to become more aware of their strengths. And this was a very small group. It would be either probably about 6 women, as opposed to the ongoing 7-week ones were mostly like maybe 10 to 12 women. And in this one-day workshop, women would each take a turn to talk for perhaps 20 minutes about their life and what they felt were some of those things that they felt particularly good about, and it could be small things, that they grew this wonderful garden and did a lot of canning, but things that they had a sense of pride about. Or it could even be something that was challenging, where maybe they had a child that had some kind of illness, and it really required them to be very present and an advocate for. So it could be a lot of different things, and so they would talk for 20 minutes, and the rest of the women would listen. And they each had little stickers, and as the woman spoke, and they really heard what they felt were strengths of this woman, they would jot them down. And then after the woman finished speaking, each of the other women would share with her what they saw, the courage that she had, for instance, maybe to really go to the school and advocate for a child who they felt was not, there was some problem in the school, or the persistence perhaps in working with this garden and with poor soil, and and then as they said each thing, they would put this sticker on this sheet of paper that the woman had, until eventually by the end of all this feedback, they would have what we called their strength wheel. And it was so powerful. Women would leave feeling so energized and empowered and affirmed.
And in this era, it's maybe overgeneralizing, it seems that that's what women really needed,
Yeah.
that they were, as a part of our culture, not looking at their strengths, but worrying about what they were being told they didn't do well or left out, so that
Right.
it seems from reports to have made a terrific difference.
It did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then just the group interaction.
The support from,
Yeah.
yes, and some of the 7-week workshops, where women would be coming back 7 weeks in a row, it gave women an opportunity to connect and to share challenges in their lives, and because for many women there was a real sense of isolation, and this challenge that I'm facing, I'm the only one, and there sometimes could be a lot of shame around it, and really not wanting anyone to know. And so, in big and small ways, these groups, the connection between the women became a real source of support and
And
really,
the I'm not alone factor,
Yes.
that I'm not the only one
Right.
coping with that. That really is amazing. What do you see as an overall role that you and the Women's Center made, the impact in the community? Could you sense while you were doing this that it wasn't just individual women benefiting?
Really, it was a grassroots movement that really, I think, touched all parts of the community, because many women were served in these workshops, and there was also individual counseling that was available, and I also had a drop-in group once a week where women could just drop in, and there was a lot of sharing about decisions that they were thinking about making, or just anything that they wanted to talk about. So many, it'd be hard for me to imagine the numbers, but there were many women who were touched by these workshops and the counseling. And those women, then went out and It certainly affected their families, it affected their friendships with other women, and so I would say it had an enormous impact.
The big picture. Did you personally in your work encounter any resistance to what the Women's Center was doing, either individuals or agencies that you had to appeal to, or did you feel in general there was active support there? We've heard from others that there was amazing amount of support from people or agencies they hadn't expected it. Did you sense that too, or were there some core resistance?
I think there were pockets of resistance, but I didn't personally experience that. The radio stations were very open and willing to provide time, for me to talk about what we were doing in this workshop program. The newspapers were very available to publish the workshops that were coming up. And my encounters with the women in the workshop, the women were very eager for this kind of connection and this kind of support. And, I imagine there was some resistance at times, from family members at home, but nothing that I recall that was really
stood out. Yeah. Now, were you there? We've talked quite a bit with others about the transition from being headquartered at Northern and being moved to the Episcopal Church and then eventually buying the Women's Center. What stage of that were you? Where did you work?
Well, I moved from being counselor at the Women's Center to a position as counselor at the University Counseling Center just prior to the time that the move took place. So I wasn't in the center of that. I continued to be involved, just I attended a lot of meetings. I was involved.
But it was no longer your actual
but
job.
It was no longer my actual job.
Okay, and when do you recall approximate date of that? Is it?
Well, I was trying to remember, and I think I made that shift the very end. I think it was probably 1979.
And then how much longer were you in the Marquette area? Because you did move.
Right. I was at the University Counseling Center, working there, and left in 87.
Okay.
Spring of 87.
And you, as you said, you continued in roles very similar to what you had done at the Women's Center. Did you stay in touch? I know you've come back into the community to visit. Did you stay in touch with any of those that you were working with or had worked to help after you left? And did that continue? Were you aware, I guess, of the continuing development of the Women's Center?
I was very aware of it. I was not closely in touch with some of the people that were hired after me. Sarah Kafer, I think, was the counselor after I left. So I was only very peripherally involved and aware.
From what you've heard, and some of that from me, but do you feel the Women's Center is still trying to live up to its mission? It did, and I think that would have been after you left, but it did expand into supporting the women's shelter, Harbor House, and then you may have been there during the time where they did a lot of trying to help particularly younger women, but women in general, explore non-traditional job, consider and get hired for. Were you involved in any of that job expansion or any of those other expansions? That was after.
Well, it was actually, I think that was started during the time that I was there, but I was not involved in that. And also another thing that was happening while I was there, but also I was not involved in it, was the Displaced Homemaker program that Frances Lamb, I think, was in charge with. For women who had been married for many years and then suddenly found that they were divorced and didn't have the job skills to really move directly into the job market. And so Frances Lamb was in charge of that program.
And that was a goal, was to literally help them develop probably some assertiveness training, but also actually train how to train for new jobs and take on.
I don't know all that that entailed, but it was to be a support for women who really needed a lot of support because of the major change that was happening in their life and the ways in which they were not really prepared for that. But that was Frances Lamb's area, and I know she would refer many of those programs to some of the workshops that our parapros were leading, because certainly the assertiveness training and goal setting and life planning workshops would be helpful to them. But she helped them with a lot of very much more concrete things.
Practical
Yeah.
links.
Right.
Yeah. And I know there were some specific groups for displaced homework.
Yes.
They actually had, again, support groups
Right.
organized, which seems to have been one of the sort of underlying things that in that day and age, and probably to this day, women need to know they aren't alone,
Right.
and that they have things in common and can help one another deal with those, which I think goes across all venues for support in a lot of areas, to know that you're not the only one and that there are others. June, are there other things that you recall, just little vignettes or groups that you taught or people that you particularly modeled that yourself after or helped model?
Well, just that, I think what was happening with the Women's Center here was a reflection of the major women's movement that was happening across the country. And that the Women's Center here was one of the first and probably one of the most expansive programs in terms of all the many different kinds of services that were offered. And when I look back to the 70s, the changes that have taken place for women in women's lives are enormous. I remember one of the in one of the trainings for the paraprofessionals that I did was to lead a guided visualization, and it was the reversal of roles that were currently in existence in the 70s, but instead of all of the ways in which men were dominant in the world, it was a shifting, and it was a visualization of women in those positions, and it was very dramatic. I mean, and it wasn't really what we were suggesting, that we end up with a lack of equality, but just simply experiencing and seeing women being dominant like that helped the women to see more clearly what was happening at that time. For instance, there were essentially no women announcers on TV. They were all men. And so often when there's something in our culture that is a certain way, we don't question it. We just think that's the way it is. So to have this visualization where we're visualizing, imagining a time when we turn on television, all the announcers are women. And because, of course, women have such a lovely voice and are very knowledgeable about world events, and so imagining a woman as president, which we still don't have, but the major scientists in the world are women, and then also looking at attitudes towards raising girls and raising boys, and I mean, this was kind of humorous, but imagining that girls are encouraged to climb trees and to be very athletic, and boys are encouraged to be quieter because their genitals are on the exterior, and so they're more vulnerable to harm. And of course, girls, their genitals are on the inside, and so they're protected, and so they're really encouraged. I mean, it was quite outrageous, but it did make a point and help women to really realize and see some of the things that were in existence at that time.
Well, and in point now to contrast, 40 years later, that a lot of that has
Yeah.
evolved. Not, again, to the extreme, which probably nobody would want, but
Right.
a balance there. That's
Well,
a
and
very
now,
great exercise.
and now women are in the military in ways that they never, in combat positions. So there have been major, major changes.
Do you feel, given that what we would call a positive, that the job is done? That now we've accomplished the goals that the Women's Center might have? Or is this an ongoing issue at most levels, whether we're talking about women taking charge of their lives or abuse situations or whatever? Do you feel we can
No,
rest
certainly
easy?
there's there's more work to be done. Um, and some of the things are quite obvious, but many of them are very subtle. And and I think, even something as subtle as women's appearance, there's still a lot of pressure on women to look a certain way, and and particularly young girls now, this is really a problem. And so a lot of subtle things that women take on, attitudes and beliefs about themselves that really need to be addressed and shifted. and big things too. I mean, we still, if we look at Congress, how many women are there in Congress? It's not a very large percent. I mean, it is moving in that direction, but there's still a lot that needs to be done.
So we encourage the Women's Center to
Yes.
continue its work, right?
Absolutely.
And with decreased funding, we're talking again about 2013, all of these organizations that support various needs are having to take a tough look at their essential mission. And we can't help but applaud the women who are still working for those goals and trying to get funding, because, and I think the acknowledgement, at least recently in the community, of the sex trafficking and the fact that there still are people showing up, women particularly, although men sometimes in abusive situations needing help out of those situations.
Right.
Whether that'll ever go away is certainly a question. So we thank you for your role at that stage, and we're going to keep working, it appears, from the people we're interviewing.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.